The Wawa Agitation and the clamor for the creation of a state for persons of Northern Igbo extraction has been over 3 decades in the making. From the sour experiences from the Civil War and the less than satisfactory positions on offer within the old Anambra establishment, there is a long list of men who have given their heart, sweat, intellect, and fortunes for the actualization of a Wawa state. Chief Christian Chukwumono, Igwe Charles Abangu, Chief Alex Ogbodo, Justice Eze Ozobu, Professor Meko Denigwe, Igwe Edward Naji, and a host of others. Was the creation of Enugu State in 1991 an idea its time was long overdue? This is the Eastern Eye. I'm Alex Ogbodo. To the Eastern Eye here on Afia TV, a program that X-rays the political, social, and economic developments around us. Joining me tonight is Comrade Fidelis Edeh, is a former Deputy President of the Nigeria Labour Congress, NLC. We also will be having the contributions of Honorable Justice Christopher Onyia, retired, who joined us in our studios earlier today. Thank you so much for joining us, Comrade Fidelis Edeh, and I should say, happy 34th anniversary to Enugu State.
Thank you, Alex, for having me. Well, thank God we are still alive to be part of this event and still witnessing the political unfolding dramas. Absolutely.
So let's talk about Enugu State, because there seem to be not a lot of narratives there as to what happened, especially in public domain. It is something that not a lot of people have a grasp of. Help us put it in perspective. When we talk about the creation of Enugu State, it wasn't something that started maybe in 1990 and climaxed in 1991.
Well, Alex, you are right that there aren't much discussion about the states in terms of what it ought to represent. And the reasons are obvious. Unfortunately, those who you've just mentioned and some not mentioned who were key players, for reasons of maybe military rule, didn't quite occupy critical positions that would have afforded that opportunity for them to share their experiences and generate narratives that subsequent generations ought to read through. If you also liken this to the Civil War, you will discover that there have been much reading, because we'll find even the observers, the actors, trying to pen down their experiences. This is not the same. I think and the Enugu maybe came late in the day, given the fact that by the time it was attained, those who actually bore the brunt of the struggle had become very old. You look at the men you just mentioned, and you discover that by 1991, none of them were young, to participate effectively, except for the great CC, who became governor, and that process somehow was aborted. But returning to what one will want to capture as part of the history. I think 2 important dates here will help us for those who will want to begin to understand, one, the essence of the struggle in terms of what prompted it and how eventually it was attained. And these dates, 1969, making reference to a meeting that was convened as the Civil War was just ending in Mbano, by CC Ono, where the likes of Abangu, Justice Ozobo, just those you mentioned, Abangu, Onwe, you can just name them, and others not mentioned, convened. By then it was not clear that the war was ending, but this meeting was convened to review the experiences of the Northern Igbo, just like you mentioned, within the Biafran enclave. You will recall that by 1957, when I will always mention this, because anybody who wants to understand the minority struggle in terms of marginalization and fear of exploitation, that was just the only commission that was constituted and had to see it and had a report. By 57, there was nothing as to Wawa and the struggle for Wawa State. So it points to the fact that whatever prompted the struggle for Wawa State emanated from the Civil War. The way now, let me remain with the word Wawa. Those who belonged to the Wawa felt they were treated during the war in terms of how they were camped, how they were cramped, and how they were recruited into the Biafran army. That was exactly the meeting Ono convened for them to go through. So by the time the war ended, that agitation had already started gaining ground. But the capping was the submission of the representation of the Wawa people. And that's the second date I'm talking about. By I think that was 1970, I think 74, thereabouts. The Justice Erikife Commission on the creation of states, 75, yeah. It didn't quite, if you look at that submission, you will discover that it was a cry of a people who were utterly marginalized. But the case of the Wawa people was also peculiar and complex. Peculiar in the sense that Enugu, that ought to be the seat, or today the capital, the heart of the Wawa land, have always also been the capital of Igbo land. If you look at 53, when the regional government started taking root. So it means that by 1991, when Enugu was created as a state, Enugu as it is today had been seat of government for almost 38 years, So what it means is that you had a people who had so much potentials, resources, who were hosts to great governmental developments. When you talk about the coal mines, when you talk about the railways and what have you, but they never actually ascended to positions that allow them to also partake and define themselves. So it is under that situation that we can begin to look at the petition or the representation of the Wawa people to Justice Erikife Commission, And when it was very obvious that Enugu was to be part of the states announced by the government of Babangida in 1987, it was a shock that it was dropped. In fact, some people who had inside information, because if you look at the creation of 12 states by Gowon, you will discover that it balanced the North-South equation. There was equity. But it was from the 1987 creation that the imbalance of 19 states that now gave the North more states emerged. And people speculated that why it was so was the drop in, the last minute abortion of the announcement of Enugu as a state, which also, reports had it. It was also sabotaged by those who felt that they were very comfortable within what represented then the Anambra State, because by then the other states had already been carved out. And if you also cast your mind back, going through history, referring to the Willington Commission I refer, you will discover that by 1957, the agitation from states from this part of the country in the old eastern region was just about Cross River, Ogoja, and Rivers. So it meant that then the core Igbo-speaking area didn't quite have that. And there was this strong organization, the Igbo Union, that also gave a sense of Igbo unity. But again, when you now want to talk about agitation, you can also begin to ask yourself, what was the level of political experience? What was the level of education, attainment that would have enabled people to begin to make a case for themselves? So actually, the struggle for Wawa State, I will want to locate from the experience of the Civil War and subsequently what happened thereafter.
All right. Thank you so much for laying it out for us. But let's get the perspectives of Honorable Justice Christopher Onyia, retired, who was in our studio earlier today. I also spoke to him on some of these issues. Let's look at his first response to the question I posed.
Well, in some ways, it does, because there's always the feeling of independence, that you are doing things by yourself. You set your goal, your agenda. Success is a progressive realization of predetermined goals. Previously, we were in eastern region of Nigeria. From there to East Central State, to old Anambra State, before Enugu was created out of old Anambra State. So all the states that were created out of the former eastern region, namely Enugu, Afia, Ebonyi, Anambra, Imo, they're all charting their own causes. And I believe that development in terms of the Nigerian context, I'm not comparing with Europe or America, that it has been kind of rapid than if we are all cloistered in one enclave. So there has been some progress made here and there in each of the new states created. Success is a progressive realization of predetermined goals. It started in the 60s, and then there was few Wawa men who could vie for election because there was this condition to get a seat in the House, either here or at the federal. You own a building, and the Wawa people were disadvantaged. It was only people like Ono, Bisindo, Nemeka Ago, and a few others, Charles Abang, who could own houses and who could contest. But I don't think that condition is still here now. So there was a time COC Chiedozie contested election against Nemeka Ago for federal seat, because the Wawa people came together under Uno's leadership. They were able to defeat the insurmountable COC. From then, it continued till the period after the Civil War. Uno was administrator of Enugu province, Edenigwe, Oji River province during the Biafran campaign. Then after the war, Ono Abangu and a host of others continued the struggle. And it crystallized in 1991 when Enugu State was created out of the old Anambra State. When the old Anambra State was created, comprising present Anambra, present Enugu, and Ebonyi, we thought that the Wawa State, which later was named Enugu, would be created. It was a period of disappointment. Then when eventually, Jim Wobe managed to become governor at that time, Ono had a short, very brief period, but when the state was now created, we've had Okwimodo, We've had Chimaroke Namani. We've had Sullivan, who performed wonders. We've had Wuru as Fanny Ugwany, and we now have Peter Mba, who is also doing well, comparatively.
All right, that was Honorable Justice Christopher Onyia, retired, speaking to us earlier. There's one more response he has, but I will come back to that later. Let me come back to you, Comrade. There are two things I want to take up with you from his response, and that's about eligibility. I mean, it wasn't something that was, it wasn't a law that was in place just because of the Wawas. It was just circumstantial that not a lot of people at that time could afford to own a house, and as such couldn't contest. And he made that point about just a handful of people could actually contest because they didn't own landed property. Help us situate this. And in the same vein, the only two civilian governors Anambra State actually had were from the Wawa extraction. Was it coincidental? Was it circumstantial? Was it providential?
Well, Alex, you know, one of the challenges in social analysis in terms of perspective, particularly when it deals with history, is that one's ideological conviction or persuasion also influences point of view. For instance, the issue of landed property or eligibility is not even something you can locate within the East Central states or even the regions. If you look at from 1943, even when it was not election pure, the colonial masters had a policy that for you to make representation, for you to participate, because it was only from 1953 that people, Nigerians, the indigenous people, now had the opportunity to contest the election. But when it was even by representation where the Governor General had to appoint, there was a clause that you must be earning, I think whether it was £100 per annum for you to be able to serve. And you can now ask yourself, what was the nature of earning or the source? You know, if you recall that by then, all blacks, not just Nigerians, those who were of African descent, who were even in the public service, were classified as those who were in the junior civil service. It was the Europeans that were running the show. And those who were even finding themselves in business, we will not say they were finding themselves in business. They were more or less agents representing those who had investments in business. Nigerians started participating in politics from 1953 through the federal election, which the distinguished Honorable Justice mentioned. But now coming, like you said, that was why I said, because I'm trying to locate here the aspect of agitation. You know, when the idea of marginalization, real or perceived, emerged, that was after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, I cannot, I've not been able to lay my hands on any record that showed that our people felt disadvantaged in terms of role. And you just made the point. We are dealing with a system where people, one way or the other, felt either excluded or that they needed to participate. If you even look at the nationalist struggle was also an agitation against the colonial rule, not for the Nigerian people, but because the Nigerians who felt that they had acquired the education felt excluded because of the policy of indirect rule. That policy was a policy that tried to indigenize governance. And under Lugard felt that the likes of those who were leaders of NCNC, that they had no mandate to speak for the entirety of Nigerians. That what they needed to do was to speak for the area where they were located and where they were participating in politics. And that was why, if you look at Zeke's politics, it was dominantly in Lagos. If you also look at that of Herbert Macaulay, it was also Lagos-based. If you also look at the struggle of independence, you will see the reluctance the North had in even accepting that Nigeria could attain independence, which would have come in 57. So, but for this discourse, I want to locate my analysis to the point that the idea of marginalization started from after the war, like I said, arising from the meeting Ono had called in Mbano in 1969. Then nobody knew that the war would end the way it ended. Then that was what, and you will discover that those who attended that meeting continued to lead the struggle for Wawa, attainment of Wawa State, up to the point it was attained in 1991. If you also look at the representation they made in 1975, that was when Moritala Mohammed, the first attempt on state creation, the Rikefe Commission. It was also the same caliber of leaders of thought and agitators. But again, when you come to struggle, where I have also had some role and participation, you will discover that part of what happens is that those who felt excluded, not as a collective now, either in their ambition or by way of aspiration, usually will want to capture it as representing. Well, it has always been the Nigerian situation. And I think it remains even the situation in every developed, in any human enclave, not even developed. If you also look at the American struggle, you know, America has always had their democracy and what have you, but never allowed blacks to participate in politics. Even their women never participated in voting. That was why, as late as 1963, we had the Martin Luther King's leading struggle for blacks, you know, to vote in America. If you also look at how Zeke lost out in Lagos before he returned to Eastern region, you will discover it was also politics of those who felt, no, how can somebody across the region come here to want to lord it over all? So politics have always been local, you know, and those who feel excluded, if they have attained some level of leadership or being the spokesperson or being opinion melder, will always aggregate that position to mean representing their own people. And that's why you continue to see, as predicted by Willing King Commission in 1957, when they said that the issue of state creation will not remove the fears of the minority. Because once you create a state, from that state will also emerge a new minority. The only state or region that was created out of place by was Midwestern. That was Western in 1963. As at then, there was no identified or identifiable marginalization they had suffered. Osadebe was leading in Western Nigeria, but he had to give it up, you know, to return to Midwest. So I think these fears are usually embedded, even as Enugu State is now. But the other aspect I want to point out is whether Enugu has thrived. And for me, it has not, you know, because if you also look at the man who personalized the Wawa struggle, you will discover that he remained in the struggle until he transited, because he felt that the aspirations or the agenda for which Enugu was procured was not being followed, was not even being dealt with. And it is very, very obvious from 1999 when we had the civilian return to democracy. As for the Modo regime, you would have seen an attempt to balance what was to be appointment and elective positions through the principle of triangular equilibrium. But again, you will also look at the dislocation that took place in Enugu, because anybody who told you that Enugu had made progress, it will be good will point to what manner of progress has Enugu made, you know, because like I tried to point out, Enugu was a seat of government from 1953 to 1991 when it was created. That's 38 years. So what it means that Enugu has always had the fortune of being where the things are happening. So if you want to point to Enugu thriving, you will have to now look at the locals. You will have to look at even where we thought was suburban areas. What has happened in Oji River? What has happened in Uji? What has happened in Ogu? What has happened in Abani? I'm talking about basic infrastructure in terms of, can people wake up and go to hospital and they are attended to? Do you have tap-borne water? What is the level of access to education? You know, we can't just sit here that we were lucky to inherit. In fact, Enugu remained in Nigeria the only state that was created as a new state, but remained domiciled while what was the old, in terms of name, Anambra had to leave. You know, so we can look at Enugu as it is situated today and has never expanded. And we will say we have tried, when in fact we had actually degenerated, because I was part of the struggle to an extent. And I knew when in the GRA here, we had pump-borne water. Even when I was living at Owan, Umunogo, water was flowing. I knew when you could go to hospital as a civil servant, you will be attended to. I knew when you could take your kids to any school. In fact, a private school was not in vogue then. I knew when people assessed accommodation. Government was, if you look at some of the buildings, particularly artisan quarters. In fact, under Chimaroke, there was a project that was set out where civil servants, you know, what that was supposed to be built for civil servants. I think it's around Ugogo. If you look at Transekulu, the entire Transekulu, these were expansions in terms of trying to provide accommodation for the Enugu people, you know. But the other dislocation we will look at is between 1991, when Enugu was created, to 1998. You know, you will discover that there was serious administrative disruption. Enugu had about, I think, 6 or 7 military governors that didn't quite plan or execute any policy. Then we had one civilian administration that came, that's Modo. So when Chimaroke came and decided to set up a committee on civil service reform, some of us felt that it was a right decision, because you cannot develop, you cannot deal with the challenges of Enugu people without a strong public service factor in terms of requisite technical skill, you know, the presence of it. Because let us look at how public administration, if it must deliver, thrives. First is the constitutive entity. Now we have Enugu State with the constitutional mandate for governance. The next thing will now be the technical ability. You know, I heard when the retired judge mentioned Sullivan. Yes, Sullivan had it. But if you also look at Sullivan's administration, you discover that he decentralized. Sullivan allowed the local government to operate. Sullivan had the public service operate. In fact, you will recall that Under Sullivan, some of the people who benefited from patronage promotion were either removed or demoted as permanent secretary. Under the military, if you recall, when Wodo left, there was this agitation we had about politicization of the public service. And a committee was set up that tried to restore merit and standard in the public service. But today, you don't have, after Chime, under Buruburu, it was a disaster. Today, what you have is just the governor. And that is why you discover that everything that is going in terms of project centers around the governor. So when the people are asking questions, people look at it as if the governor is being criticized. No. If you look at Chimaroke's early years, that is 1999 to, I think, up to his second year, Chimaroke will host signposts for projects, public projects that were being executed, and he will put his name as the client, not even Enugu State government. That was the mentality of governance for him. And one of the things that now brought about the complete collapse of the public service and the House of Assembly was the failed attempt to impeach Chimaroke. Chimaroke now appropriated power. In fact, if you look at the inauguration brochure of his second tenure, Chimaroke defined the office of the governor as the ultimate political authority in the state. He identified that, yes, there is this local government that ought to operate, you have the judiciary and what have you, but now said that the governor represents the central political authority. Do you have such thing in the Constitution? I'm talking about documents you can search. And why was it so? Chime had a stint with the public service. So Chime had a knowledge of how the public service ought to operate. But Chimareke had no such knowledge. Buruburu, everything was about the government house. And that is why you discover that under them, it's either them or nothing. Even for little things that you need to assess from the ministry, you discover that people will tell you, just as today, that is the governor, to the point now that Enugu State governor, from reports, is inaccessible. He is inaccessible because activities and powers and authorities are centralized. If not, if you look at the opera era, you will discover that people were talking about the programs of the opera's administration. They were not talking about opera himself as the premier. No, it was his administration. When you talk about agriculture, you can track it, you can see the policies. When you talk about tourism, you can track it. When people talk about the presidential hotel that people are now talking about being refurbished, you will discover that the idea of the presidential hotel, London Opera, was to provide for the industries he has built around the Enugu Urban, as it were. That is how we will refer it today. You talk about the Niger Steel, you talk about the asbestos, you talk about the Niger Sem, but those were in place before the presidential hotel. So the point I'm making is that once in governance, in terms of democracy, you have a constituted demography. In terms of now, we have Enugu State. And the Constitution has allowed governance. What is now required is the technical skill, the requisite technical skill. And that was why, if you look at the creation of Enugu State, when Anambra left, they left with the technical skill that was in situ in the old Anambra. And that was why Enugu felt as if the public service of Enugu then, as it were, was beheaded, was amputated. In fact, I can't quite put it in terms of statistics now, but I don't think Enugu had up to 3 permanent secretaries from the old Anambra that remained. So you find directors that started acting as permanent secretaries. But
that's right.
this knowledge is not something you can ascribe. It is attained.
Okay.
And
okay, comrade, sorry,
being viable.
yes, comrade.
Concept.
Yes, comrade, we really need to take a break. When we return, we'll continue that conversation, and also we will listen to the final submissions from Honorable Justice Christopher Onyia, retired, and then we'll continue to ask you some more questions about Enugu at 34. We will, after listening to Justice Christopher Onyia, we'll come back to the issue of how Enugu managed to build herself. Well, the argument is that, okay, after all, Enugu inherited the administrative legacy of the old Anambra, the old Eastern region, that it should do better. Is it doing better? If it's not, why? After the break, stay with us. Welcome back to the Eastern Hour here on Afia TV. It's a program that x-rays the political, social, and economic developments within the southeast of Nigeria. I told you earlier that we had in the studios earlier today, Honorable Justice Christopher Onyia. Let's listen to the final part of his submission.
I will say agitations will never cease, because once you ignite a fuse and it starts burning, there's a limit to how you can extinguish it. You know, it will have done some collateral damage. Take, for instance, the people of the Calabar-Ogoja rivers. They were agitating against Alex Ogbodo launched his campaign, and these things continue to trickle down. You know, we are agitating for Wawa State. When Wawa State came on board, we became clannish. You now have the Nsoka man, you have the Nkano man, you have the Udi, Eziago man. So people want to narrow these things down to their bedrooms. The agitations will continue, but if you are a seasoned or an administrator with a good agenda, those things will not prevent you from doing what is nice. If you go now to the quiet of your bedroom and reflect, you will see Enugu is not the way it used to be, you know, and it's the administration that makes things work. You know, abroad, the entire system is almost private sector driven. Government makes policies like in foreign affairs, defense, immigration, and all that. It's during election time that you will now know the scope of what government does. Otherwise, everybody settles to what he does, you know.
That was Honorable Justice Christopher Onyia, retired. And just one thing that I have noticed now, Comrade Fidelis Edeh, just like you were saying, that the governor seemed to be more visible in the whole scheme of things, which is also what he also slightly referenced. He says that institutions like ours are supposed to be driven by the private sector, but you now see that politically exposed persons seem to be right at the fore of everything. And going back to the question I asked earlier before we went on that break, Enugu inherited the legacy of the former Eastern region. A lot of people are arguing that Enugu should be far ahead of this. Whatever it is Enugu is celebrating as accomplishment should actually be a stepping stone. Because every other person left Enugu to go and set up their capital. Enugu didn't have to set up any capital city. It inherited it on a platter. So what was the problem? What was it that stopped Enugu from actually moving as fast as expected?
Alex, I had alluded to this point earlier when I told you that those who were never part of the struggle eventually received the rent or the spoils of the struggle. And they also don't bother to find out what it is that the whole concept of the creation of Enugu State represents. Now, let me make this point so that it does not escape. I think those who are advocating that the private sector ought to drive governance, it will be good they tell us how and where it works. Not even in the United States, not even, yes, United States, because that's the presidential model. Of course, we have other models. China is one of the biggest economy in the world, but we also know that it's not the private sector that drives it. I think there's a misreading about how people try to confuse public administration with government role and trying to provide enabling environment. If you also look at the Nigerian Constitution, particularly the economic objective, it is very, very clear, Section 16, on how the government have to situate or facilitate economic environment for everybody to thrive. If you also look at the fact that ours ought to be where government should provide not just security, but the well-being of the people. In fact, the whole lot of Chapter 2, which political parties are expected to draw their manifesto from, it's about how governments have to stimulate the environment. So when people talk about private sector, you discover that it's the private sector that is driving the economy of Enugu, and that is why it is not running, and that is why it is not delivering. Because from the government house, the governor now thinks he has the whole knowledge on how to administer. Let me share with you some of the progresses we made, and it was not made by the private sector. Under the military, incidentally, I was part of that struggle. I was part of the June struggle. I was part of the struggle for the creation of Enugu State. I was very, very active in the trade union movement. Let us take the issue of housing, for instance. Enugu has always had the challenge of rents, but we were able to get government to establish the rent tribunal. And there was a clear policy on how rent had to be fixed. There is a rent tribunal, and the government also had a commitment that they will continue to provide accommodation for certain categories, not just civil servants or the people. If you go and look at the rent deed, you will now see the classification. In fact, we, at a point when the government was hell-bent on also charging those who were living in government quarters rent, we said, okay, you charge them, but that means you also have to pay them their rent subsidy. If you also look at the issue of health, you will discover how through the struggle, there was need for government to continue to cite provide basic health care through basic health facilities. Even in big countries, you will discover the issue of transportation, the issue of electricity, the issue of water is not privatized to the point where the citizens on their own. If you look at Obasanjo 2024 reform, electricity reform, which is part of the challenge we are now having even in Enugu, you will discover the categories of how the electricity companies have to be able to distribute and the intervention of government, particularly for the rural areas. So when people talk about visibility of the private sector, you will now ask, are you going to have a private sector that is not regulated? And if you are talking about regulation, it is the public service. That is what is lacking in Enugu. And that is why when you talk about taxation being excessive, you discover that people are talking about taxation from the point that it's just about the governor and those they have contracted. You have no intervening agency where the people can go and be assessed. When you talk about transportation, you discover it is no longer how it used to be. When you talk about healthcare, you discover that the private sector is dominant, but that private sector that is dominant are also people who are government doctors, who are employed in government hospitals, who are also providing private medical care. So you have no regulation. You have nobody monitoring what the private sector is doing. Today, if you take for into cognizance the bar conference that is going into Enugu, why will government suspend everything that has to do with the MOT? Why would they collapse? Why would they suspend it if it's friendly? It's just because government don't want to be embarrassed. So it's like the government is visitors friendly more than those for which this state was attained. And like you aptly captured, which is very clear. Why would we even continue to talk about development in Enugu Urban? Why is it something anybody from Enugu should be proud of? A capital that was developed from 1953, like I pointed out to you, it was the capital of the Eastern region before East Central State, before Anambra State. Then you now had Anambra that Ebonyi had to leave. You had Anambra that Enugu had to leave. And during the access sharing, you discover that nothing was removed from what we now have as Enugu. But what we had under Chimaroke was the conversion of what used to be historical edifices that were also providing essential services for the people through the public service. You still have a place, estate, market garden. But that market garden, was it designed for estate? You still have the Kenga, you know, where you have behind the central bank. You know, today, you now have schools being converted for the smart schools, and you no longer expect that Enugu will be part of those who will also produce sports, you know, excellent people who will be great footballers, great basket players, and what have you. So why is it so? It is so because the public service has been collapsed. They no longer provide those elements, the essential that help the governor or the executive arm of government to formulate policy, which they will now take to House of Assembly. I've made the point earlier that the failed attempt to remove Chimaroke as governor, to impeach him, was what brought about, as it were, the end of a functional and effective House of Assembly in Enugu State. Because if you have a functional and effective House of Assembly, so some of the things which the citizens are complaining are policies that ought to have passed through the House of Assembly, and you know, you will conduct public hearings and what have you. But it is now between the government and the people. So it is more of a diarchy where you have the governor who thinks for the people, whether the people accept it or not. So if anybody says Enugu has tried, it will be good to find out which Enugu. Yeah, Enugu have tried for those who have benefited from appropriating the instrument of governance, but not for the people whom the struggle for Enugu was intended. I'm talking about the rural communities. We're all from communities. We can sit back and ask ourselves, what is the presence of government from the time Enugu was created in 1994? one. Yeah, is there a place? In fact, insurgents has even made it worse in terms of headers and farmers challenge. But today, it is no longer headers farmer challenge. It is clear-cut banditry. I have suffered that in Oboka, under Buruburu, when my rice farm was invaded, and nobody attended to us. So many people has left farming as a result of the experiences they have garnered. So the point I am making here is that if Enugu was a product of marginalization, it means that the Enugu people ought to enjoy certain privileges. There are things Enugu people have to enjoy as a result of the fact that Enugu is now a state created for Ndi Enugu. But that does not mean that I'm advocating for the exclusion of those who are not of Enugu extraction. No. What I'm saying is that the Enugu urban ought to be the center for the Igbo people. So for you to continue to beautify Enugu urban, people will demolish and rebuild, or people will come into projects that are not viable, they will reactivate it, and people will tell you that Enugu is thriving. Look at the poverty index. In April, the NBS, National Bureau for Statistics, identified Enugu as the highest in the cost of living index. I think it was 35 points. So, and if in terms of poverty, we're also ranking low and cost of living is high, you can now imagine the average Enugu person for whom Anambra had to leave his fate. So I believe that you cannot reconnect to the Enugu people for whom the state was created without reinventing the public service. The public service have to be recreated. This public service have to be functional, because it is only through the public service you can appropriate or begin to feel the feelings of the people.
That's right.
Because it's about policy. We are no longer in military rule that is ruled by a decree. If governments must live by policy, it means policy represents the interest, the aspirations of majority of the people. So if we still run a governance model that thinks for the people, you wake up, you say, this is what I think that the people desire, then it is not democracy. The people's rights are being infringed. The people have no even organ where they can make their case. So those who say Enugu has thrived, it will be good they begin to point out what area of Enugu in terms of location. But for me, Enugu cannot be the Enugu city, because in terms of Enugu city, if I've even degraded, because some of the beautiful things we used to have. When I was living in GRA, we had the cleanest water, because that was the one that was coming from Eva Valley. And you know, the Eva Valley was spring because it was driven by wind. I remember in those days when we were to embark on strike and we want to shut down, we can only access Ajali. You discover that there's no way you can stop that of Eva. But do we have that today? So this thing is not, when we discuss this way, people think it's a critique of government. We are saying we have missed the track. And if Enugu State people must benefit, you must return to what works. And what works was working under Anambra when we were even talking about marginalization. So we must return to put the structure of governance. And that structure of governance is to create a public service that will be able to appropriate and deliver to the executive the feeling of the people in terms of policy ingredients, the elements which the executive can formulate policy. Because they can now begin to assess the House of Assembly as constituents that will now represent the people. It is through that process that those in the House of Assembly can begin to say, no, the interests of my people are not included. They will now begin to think. At the end of the day, you will discover that you are now producing a document that will now be a budget that represents the interests and the aspirations of the people. And with that process, you will discover that the governor will no longer be in the picture of what the people are going to engage. Rather, the governor will now be the one taking credit for implementation of programs, because he will be all of a good that decide what happened in the entirety of the state, and you know it's an impossibility.
Thank you so much, Comrade Fidelis Edeh. That would be a good place to leave it. Comrade Fidelis Edeh is the former Deputy President of the NLC. Thank you so much for talking to us on the Eastern Eye tonight. And of course, we have a documentary in the works on the creation of Enugu State. Once it's done, we'll tell you when it will be airing. It's something rigorous we're putting together, because we need to speak to all the people that are connected to what happened right until 1991 when Enugu was created. That's the Eastern Eye for tonight. My name is Alex Ogbodo. Good night.